Thank you all for joining us. I am going to give you a brief glimpse into some of the amazing accomplishments our panelists have. You can read their full bios on our website. As I said, I'm just going to be touching on some of the things that we're doing. I'm going to start off with Emyle Watkins. She is an award-winning multimedia investigative journalist. She has experience in both newspaper, TV, and radio. She's WFAO's disability reporter, and she also authored the Global Investigative Journalism Network's Guide to Investigative Disability Issues. We also have Emily Ladau. She is a disability rights activist, writer, storyteller, and digital communications consultant. She is the newly named editor of Able News and the author of Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally. And last and certainly not least is Alfonso Castillo. He is an award-winning reporter for Newsday. He's worked for Newsday for 25 years with more than 15 years on the paper's transportation beat, which a lot of his reporting focuses on accessibility issues. Guys, thank you so much for being here and for doing this. I really appreciate this. As a vision impaired journalist, I feel that this is a topic important to me. I know that you each have your own stories of why accessibility and disability journalism is important to you. Emyle Watkins, why don't you start us off? Why is this such an important topic for you?
Hi. So for me personally, I grew up with a disabled parent. My dad was born with some disabilities, but when he was a young adult, he got in a motorcycle accident and then a work accident. And so I grew up with a parent who was on SSDI. And then when I got into my teens, I started developing multiple chronic illnesses. And then in young adulthood, I found out that I was actually born with a disability called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. EDS is a genetic connective tissue disorder. And basically that means you're born with it, your family can pass it down. And connective tissue is all of the tissue throughout your body. And basically it can cause joint dislocations, digestive issues, migraines, a whole bunch of different I don't want to say smaller disabilities, but it's like a bunch of disabilities under one disability. And so I grew up seeing what my dad went through, but then I started around the same age that he went through those things, going through them myself and seeing how not only does our industry have accessibility issues, but also the accessibility issues that people with disabilities experience aren't being covered in their communities. And so 3 years ago, I joined WBFO to help them build their disabilities beat. My understanding is we might be the only NPR station in the country to have a full-time disability reporter. And we cover disability from a social perspective. So instead of thinking about like medical treatments, medical advancements, things that put the onus on the disabled person to change, we focus on how could society change and focus on access to education, transportation, housing, and employment. So it's very personal to me because I grew up with a loved one and I also live with a disability myself.
Thank you. Alfonso.
Hi. So covering the transportation beat for Newsday since 2008, accessibility has always been a super important a topic. You know, you cover these board meetings, and there is always a huge contingent of advocates from the disabilities community because there are so many issues that reaches into their lives as far as public transportation. I got more of a connection to the issue when my second son was born. He's deaf, and so my wife and I have navigated our own accessibility issues over the last 13 years since he's been born. I had the opportunity last year to write a cover story and put together a video for Newsday, kind of dealing with that because my kid loves movies. We all go through movies all the time. So we did a story about the need to make movie theaters more accessible for deaf people, people who are hard of hearing. And just the issue of accessibility comes up all the time. Certainly with the Long Island Railroad's big service overhaul last year with the launch of Grand Central Madison, there were a loads of complaints, concerns raised by folks with disabilities, particularly at Jamaica, where transferring trains got significantly more complicated, difficult, requires now going up and over. So it's something that certainly is near and dear to me. I try to cover it as much as I could. I think having a disability beat is a fantastic idea, and maybe one I'll pass along. I'd love to see that. And I've always thought of it as almost sort of a mini beat for me, and so as much as I can, I've tried to sort of like interweave it in my coverage.
Thank you. Emily.
Yes, hi everyone. Again, I'm Emily Ladau, and I just started the role of editor of Able News, which is a publication that has been around since 1991. We just were acquired by an organization on Long Island called the Viscardi Center. So we are essentially in startup mode right now, startup journalism mode. And it's been an incredible adventure. But for me, I am someone who identifies as disabled. You're not able to see it in the screen, but I am a wheelchair user. I was born with a physical disability, and so disability has always been a part of my life, part of my experience. It's something that I proudly count among my identities. I call myself a disabled woman. And I came to the realization pretty early on that the way to communicate with other people about disability was through storytelling. I've always had a bit of a mantra that informs my work in that if you want the world to be accessible to the disability community, then let's make the stories, the experiences, the ideas surrounding disability more accessible to the world. And by that, I don't mean put the burden on people with disabilities to always do the educating, but rather create platforms where people can share their stories, where we can communicate about disability in a way that is humanizing and relatable, because we all connect through storytelling. I've had 2 prior editor roles before this. I've also been a writer, author, journalist for quite some time now. And I do everything through the lens of my particular disability experience, but also recognizing that I'm only one person and cannot speak for everyone. So I like to do what I can to amplify the stories of others, and being able to serve in the role of editor for a disability focused publication really allows me the opportunity to support other people, to share what's important to them and to share their stories. So for me, storytelling is at the heart of everything that I do, and being able to create those connections is what drives me forward.
Starting on the topic of just getting started, Emily L., what would you say to a journalist who is this may be their first time covering a disability issue and they are nervous about it? What would you say to them?
I think the best advice that I can give is to remember to center the disability experience. So often when disability is covered in the media, we are given the story through the lens of someone non-disabled. So it will be someone who is a talking head expert, right? It might be the family of a person with a disability. And I want to clarify that people communicate in different ways. And so perhaps communicating with a journalist, with a reporter, is not necessarily accessible for someone with a disability. But at the same time, do the due diligence to create opportunities for people with disabilities to tell their own stories. You can absolutely have people who are surrounding that story, whether it's a family member, a caregiver, whether it's somebody who is a doctor, a researcher, right? But at the same time, if you're not centering the actual disability experience in the story that you're telling, then it's not really a story about disability. It's a story about what other people think about disability. And so I always bring it back to the mantra of nothing about us without us, which is the rallying cry of the disability community, and a call to action really for anyone who's covering a topic about disability. Make sure that if you are talking about disability, that you are not doing it without the disability community involved. And I know that it might feel like you are going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing in an interview, but give yourself grace, have an open conversation. If it is your first time engaging with someone about disability for a story, I think it's okay to own up to that and to say, I'm new to covering the topic of disability and I want to do this justice. How can I make this more comfortable and accessible for you? And what would you like to see as the end result for this story? So I think it's just about dialogue and about making sure that the disability community is centered in conversations about disability.
Thank you. Emily W., you've written an entire guide about it. What are some tips that you have for people who want to find the right resources and the right people to speak to for the story that they may be covering? Because you don't want to go in the wrong angle.
Yeah, and just to jump off of what Emily said, which was just perfect. I think that for people, the thing you have to remember is that a lot of us have grown up kind of segregated from the disability community. Like, even if you knew someone with a disability, when you write about disability, you're going to encounter people with disabilities you've never seen before, you've maybe never heard of. And talking to someone about their disability can feel intimidating. It might feel like it's almost too personal to talk about. But if someone wants to talk to you about an issue going on in their lives, it's just like any other person wanting to talk to you about an issue going on in their lives. And you just need to treat them as another person. And finding like this community wants to talk to the news. And I think that the issue has been that the news hasn't always covered us correctly, and that a lot of times our stories have been made to be just inspirational, or like, we're exceptional for just doing the same things as other disabled people. So when you're going out and other people, other non-disabled people, like a disabled kid playing basketball, just like a non-disabled kid, that becomes a story for really no reason. It's going to take some time to build trust with sources, but there are sources out there that want to talk to you. And it's just about taking the time. And like Emily said, the way we've been taught to do news and to do reporting might be inaccessible to them. We're always taught to meet with someone in person. That might not be the case with someone with a disability. They might be housebound. They might be COVID cautious. They may also not be comfortable talking on the phone or meeting in person. You might have to text with them for a while. But take the time and just try and find those groups, like Emily said, that are disability centered. Most areas have self-advocacy groups. Most areas have Down syndrome social centers. Most areas have Special Olympics groups. Almost every area has an independent living center. And I would really start with your independent living center, because they're often a wealth of knowledge. And again, just going back to what Emily said, find people with disabilities. They might not always, we all communicate differently, and don't let that be a barrier, and just take the time to get to know people, take the time to earn the trust of this community, and find those people with disabilities. And even, I've met parents and family members who are like, I'll speak for them. And I'm like, if I'm going to do the story about your loved one, I at least need to know that I have their consent. So I need to at least speak with them once. And a lot of times, after talking with families and getting them comfortable, you end up getting to interview that person who's never been interviewed before. And sometimes that's the best interview of all. And you're actually hearing from the person experiencing the issue. So don't be afraid to let that person advocate for themselves.
Great. Alfonso, is there anything that you want to say on that before I go on to my next question?
I just love everything I'm hearing. It's both useful tips for me, and also to some extent reinforcement that I've been doing some things right, because it is difficult when you don't have disability, trying to hit the right tone, that kind of thing. And something that was just brought up that is very much the case is avoiding pity, avoiding a term that you often hear, inspiration porn. My not to disparage my own organization, but we did a video a while back that was about a young man with a developmental disability who bowled, and that was kind of the extent of the story, right? He bowled, and people bowled with him, and yeah, to me, it's like, no, I think part of it also is sort of asking yourself, why are we doing this story? What's the purpose? And some of the stories that and I probably haven't written nearly on the topic as much as the other two panelists, but when I have touched on it, I think in every case there's been a purpose, right? And the purpose is to shine a light on an issue that is important, that a lot of people may not know about, and that hopefully with some attention can lead to change. So the story I did about the lack of accessibility in movie theaters, there are a lot of other municipalities, including New York City, that passed laws requiring movie theaters to have open caption theaters. And certainly in the back of my head, I thought, well, this is something that could come to Long Island if maybe people knew about it more, or even the story I've done about some accessibility challenges in the MTA system, I think has brought attention to some issues and maybe put some pressure on people who have the ability to make a change and make those decisions. So, it should be more than about just kind of getting an reaction, that kind of thing. I mean, like any other news story, there should be a bigger purpose for why you're pursuing it at all.
Perfect. And before I open it up to the audience, Alfonso, I want to go back to you, especially every topic that impacts a non-disabled person also impacts everyone else. One of the biggest issues I found on Long Island after housing would be transportation. And you obviously cover the MTA and the LIRR quite often. How much of a challenge is it dealing with such a large organization that has so many accessibility issues for their riders who really do need this every single day to be able to get about their everyday life?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, and some of those accessibility issues aren't on the surface. So very often the MTA, you'll raise an issue of accessibility, and they'll say, well, 96% of our Long Island Railroad stations are accessible. That doesn't tell the whole story, right? Because you hear about folks who are for example, that video and story I did about accessibility issues at Jamaica Station, we and maybe later I could share a link. We rode with a disabilities advocate who uses a wheelchair, who's at a Floral Park, and we took the train with her to Jamaica, an accessible station. MTA makes the point that there is an app that you can look up and see if all the elevators are operating, and we did, and it showed that they were, and we get there and the elevator's out, and she wasn't able to get to the platform to get on the train that she needed to get on. It becomes a whole thing. We're now surrounded by workers trying to kind of like troubleshoot this issue. They tell us you either got to wait for another train, or you've got to cut through a train on a platform to get to the other platform. On paper, none of this would show up as an accessibility issue, but there's stuff like this all the time. I hear about from riders who are left on station platforms, because they can't get the attention of a conductor to hold the train long enough to get them on board. Sometimes this requires setting up a ramp to get people on board, and there's all kinds of little things and big things, whether it is communication modes to make sure that you're able to communicate either with people who are hard of hearing or deaf or visually impaired. Again, it's all to say it goes beyond, is there an elevator at your station? Is there a ramp at your station? Accessibility, I think, covers so many different facets that, again, are not right on the surface. And so that's why it's not shame necessarily the point, but it is bringing attention to this stuff. And it's one thing that I've found covering the MTA is that the disabilities community are such great advocates for themselves. And I, over my 15 plus years covering MTA board meetings every month for 15 years, I can't remember a time where there wasn't a large contingent of members of the disability community there making some kind of point, whether it is about paratransit, which is another huge story that again just paratransit under the ADA, public transportation agencies have to essentially offer some equivalent transit service to a subway route or a bus route, and it's essentially door-to-door service. But it can be so lacking in often where you've got folks who talk about waiting hours, sometimes in the rain, to get picked up. And it's important that people know this, and it's important that pressure is put on the people that could make a difference.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to go into the questions now. We have some coming in. And again, if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat or you can raise your hand. We're going to start with a question from George. And this is, he said, this is for anyone on the panel. Do you think the media's reluctance to cover disabilities is because they think it doesn't relate enough to their audience, or they truly are ignorant to the issues and are afraid to insult anyone to say something wrong? Emily L., why don't we start with you on that one?
I think this is a great question, and I think it's very much in a both and not an either or situation. I think, first of all, people consider disability far too often to be a very niche issue. They relegate it to the sidelines, and I often say to the margins of marginalization, because they assume that it's not relevant to them. And we don't have the consciousness that disabled people are the world's largest minority. There's more than 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. We often lack the context that disability cuts across every single identity group, and that anyone can become disabled at any time. And we also don't even think about it from the standpoint of just here in America, 1 in 4 US adults has some type of disability, and that's probably an undercount. So we assume that disability is not relevant to us. We don't think about it. And if we do think about it, we've been socialized to think about disability from a negative standpoint, or without the depth and complexity and nuance that it really requires. We just assume that it doesn't matter for us. But the reality is that you or somebody you know or love, somebody you work with, somebody in your community has a disability. And that could very well be you, even if you're not identifying as such. And so it becomes essential for us to first recognize that disability is relevant to every audience. Every issue is a disability issue because every issue impacts disabled people. And I think that people are ignorant of that fact because we've put ourselves in this vicious cycle where so much of the coverage that we're still seeing in the media is, like, for example, Alfonso was saying, a person with a disability went bowling. Well, was that a news story? Did that actually do anything to move the needle for the disability community? What did you want your audience to actually take away from that story? Was there a call to action? Did people learn something other than that people with disabilities also have lives like other people do? And unfortunately, we're still at that very basic level of reporting in a lot of senses, because look, I get it. The news is rough. Sometimes at the end of the 6 o'clock news, or as you're flipping through the newspaper and you're like, wow, the world is kind of terrible out there. We want that warm and fuzzy story. We want something that's just going to make us feel good for a minute, but it's making you feel good at the expense of other people, or it's making you feel better about yourself at the expense of other people. So when we're constantly seeing news stories, media coverage that lacks nuance and depth, it perpetuates the cycle of how we think about disability. I think that we've been moving consistently in the right direction, And there are so many reporters out there who do an incredible job when it comes to covering disability, disabled and non-disabled reporters. And I want to celebrate that because I think we're moving in the right direction. But it's really a matter of seeking out that deeper, nuanced coverage and recognizing that just because you think something is irrelevant to you right now doesn't mean that it's irrelevant to you. Disability is something that anybody can experience at any time. And so if we can move beyond this fear of talking about it, this fear that we're going to mess up and say the wrong thing, so we shouldn't talk about it at all, or that it's not relevant to us, and so we shouldn't talk about it at all. I think that that's how we begin to shift perceptions, let ourselves make some mistakes, but know that we can do better and come back and be better in how we're reporting about and covering disability.
Thank you. Emily W., I mean, you're fortunate enough to have an entire beat. Does that give you more free reign to really dig deeper into, I don't want to say smaller issues, because every issue is an issue and it has ramifications for everyone, but does it really let you go deeper into those kinds of things where if you were in a typical newsroom, you would have to have some sort of immediacy to the story?
I would say that I get to dig deeper because my station has made a commitment to digging deeper into this. The thing is, I can't really get into the smaller issues impacting people with disabilities because the large ones aren't being covered enough by everyone else. And so I have this entire population in my community coming to me and maybe two other reporters that consistently cover disability. And it's like we can't take that whole load. And the disappointing thing is that there is a disability story on every beat. Any story can be a disability story. There is a disability angle in everything we do. Like with the transportation beat, there's a huge accessibility angle. And I think to what Emily said, it's all about perception too. I think that I think a lot about Joe Shapiro's book, No Pity, which I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about the history of disability. But he kind of categorizes that we grew up seeing kind of like three main images of disability throughout recent history. We saw the quote unquote freak show, these people with disabilities being put on display and being profited off of. We see the super crip, which is that inspirational image of disability. It's like, wow, they overcame their disability. And like, it creates this, I want to say, it kind of does create an unrealistic expectation of disability that like, you should be super happy and positive all the time and constantly like nothing ever gets in your way and you're never complaining and you're just somehow pushing through it because disability is on you. And then we have the medical image of disability and this idea that disability is this pathologized thing. It's this illness, it's something to be cured. We saw a lot with polio, how, kids with polio would be used in ads to be like, get vaccinated. You don't want your kid to be a kid with polio, but that's quite detrimental to kids who do have polio, or post-polio, I should say. And we grow up with these images of disability that aren't realistic. And so when we come into newsrooms, no matter what newsroom you're in, you're going to find people who still believe that disabled people are always inherently inspirational. You're going to find people who think that disability is a medical thing. You're going to find people who think that disability is like this surprising, interesting thing that you just, want to poke at. And I think that when we start thinking about how we cover disability, we have to think of a much broader image of disability, a much more realistic image of disability. And I think the challenge is that realizing when you're pitching to an editor or when you're talking to someone about a disability story you have to realize that they probably grew up with these images of disability, or they believe disability is a medical thing, or they think that, or honestly, deep down, they're scared of disability, right? Because when people see me with my knee braces on, they think of injury, they think of not walking as well. And if you've never used a mobility aid, it might scare you because you can't imagine what that's like. But I've also lived with my disability my entire life. So I'm sorry, I can't imagine what it's like to be non-disabled. and I kind of like my life. I'm very proud of my identity. And I think that, sorry, that just kind of became a side tangent, but I think that you have to realize how other people are looking at disability and adapt to that and kind of meet them where they're at. And with any story you're pitching about disability, you need to think about how that story is going to impact and be looked at by people with disabilities. But you do also have to think about that broader audience. And that can be really helpful in a pitch is how are you thinking about both those audiences? And even for me covering a disabilities desk, every time I pitch to my editor, she wants to hear, how does this impact people with disabilities? How are they going to benefit from the story? But also, how are you going to be educating people who are not disabled on this? And how is this story going to impact them? So that would be my advice, is really like, it might be frustrating to run into people who have a different view of disability, but until we show them a new view of disability, we can't get rid of these outdated views, right?
Yep, perfect. Okay, next question is from Raphael, and he says, does anyone ever experience hate or discrimination in your coverage? If so, how do you mentally prepare for it? Alfonso, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. I mean, not living with a disability, but it's Long Island, so there's no shortage of that. I mean, of negative comments, that kind of thing. I honestly, whether it's a story that's related to people with disabilities or not, you really do have to tune it out. Well, I should qualify that. Um, Check it out, but if it is just sort of bad faith negativity, then tune it out. I am always up for some good faith criticism, productive criticism, that kind of thing. But the haters, I don't even respond.
Emily L., do you want to comment on that one?
Sure, happy to. And I mean, point well taken, Alfonso, about it being Long Island. I grew up on Long Island. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, and then moved to New York City and found that people are not shy about saying what they feel, especially not here. But I think for me as a disabled woman, I know that it's a risk that I always take when I am putting myself out there, whether it's my story or someone else's story. I expect that not everybody is going to come to the story with an empathetic mindset, with a willingness to look beyond their own lens and their own experiences. And for me, I've tried to realize that you cannot convince everyone. And I don't mean to make this sound like I'm being a motivational speaker here, but I've come to remind myself of the power of the ripple effect. And, if you throw a stone in the ocean, it's not going to make a wave, but it is going to make a ripple. And that ripple is going to have an impact on other people. And so, yes, I've received all manner of negative comments, especially when I am not necessarily reporting on something, but I'm actually doing more of a journalistic critique of something, often critiquing portrayals of disability in the media, in which case I am then told that I am bitter or a complainer, or that I should just be grateful that someone in a wheelchair was on TV in the first place, or the list goes on, or that I'm a drain on society, and nobody needed to give airtime to my thoughts. And I mean, gosh, I've heard it all. And I try to remember that those people ultimately are probably not the people that I'm going to reach. And that's frustrating, but that's okay, because there is somebody else out there, even if they're not loud in the comments section, who may feel seen by what it is that I've shared, or the story that I've told, or by someone else's story that I've had the privilege of amplifying through the work that I do as an editor. So if I can have an impact on one person, if I can make one person feel like they were well represented, like they were seen, like an issue that mattered to them also matters to other people, then that's more important to me than the hater in the comments who has decided that I'm a waste of space simply because of my disability. It's a harsh thing to say, but I've just come to reason with myself that I'm working to make an impact on the people who want to hear it. And if I can change someone's mind, that's amazing. But I also hope that, um, you know, the real impact of my work at the end of the day is that I have the opportunity to connect with people who were looking for that sense of community and solidarity.
Aaron, if I might just to follow up
Of
on
course.
that.
Of course. Yeah.
One way that occurred to me that a negativity sometimes manifests with issues with disabilities, covering communities with disabilities, is um, from the able-bodied person for whom accessibility becomes an inconvenience, right? And that's something that certainly I've dealt with a lot in my coverage. When whether it's the MTA saying that um, transfers need to operate a certain way at a station because the vast majority of their passengers are able-bodied and it's not an issue for them. So changing it would inconvenience them. Or, I remember in the story I did about accessibility in movie theaters, I remember interviewing some of these theater owners and hearing from them that one of the reasons that they don't offer open caption screenings or don't often is because they get complaints from hearing movie viewers who are annoyed by the words on the screen. And I think it's important to sort of get past that and to understand that one of the issues with accessibility is that the able bodied community, which is the majority of people, might be inconvenienced a little by some of this, but that's fine, and that's the price that society should be willing to pay, because it is a difference between that person being annoyed a little bit or delayed a little bit, or somebody, and not necessarily a small group of people either. I mean, as we've touched on, we're talking a large community being inconvenienced a lot, and it's not an extra 5 minutes on your commute. It's potentially an extra several hours to your commute if you are not able to catch that train, or the reason that I even came up with that story about accessibility in movie theaters was because I drove with my son and my whole family out of our way to find a movie theater that was open captioned, and the movie starts and it's not open captioned. And again, for the other people in the theater who weren't counting on it, it was fine for them, but it became a huge inconvenience for us, right? And I think that's what so much of disability coverage has to be, is getting through to the humanity of people, that for some amount of people, maybe it's not you, maybe it's not anybody but for some people, they are hugely affected by this. This is not a small issue to them.
Emily, did you want to follow up?
Yes. Sorry, I know we all have a lot of thoughts on this question,
no.
but I kind of read this question a little bit differently too. And I just want to say, like, really agree with everything that's been said, and especially what Emily said about dealing with hate, because just existing as a disabled person, I don't know. There are people on the internet who are going to troll you and bother you and say weird stuff to you. And you just have to remember those aren't the people who know you best. But I kind of read this question, and the other thing I think about is, especially if you write about disability a lot, you're going to be encountering a lot of stories where you see a lot of hate and discrimination, and that can also be really heavy, and you might relate to some of it. I know that a story that kind of like weighed on me a lot recently that I did was a woman went to a Special Olympics fundraiser at a local restaurant chain and was discriminated against, and she had to eat off of a chair because they wouldn't seat her at an accessible table. And so I went and spoke to some legal experts about that and dug into that a bit and kept bothering the restaurant to be like, hey, what have you done to fix this? And covering these stories, it might really weigh on you. You might encounter stories that really surprise you, and you just think, like, how can this keep happening? Like the fact that disabled people can be paid a sub-minimum wage based on a law from the 1940s, or the fact that disabled people can still be sterilized in many states, or that there are people who are young people living in nursing homes because there's not enough group homes for them. And like hearing these stories is gonna weigh on you, but I would also encourage people to do what my editors encourage me to do. And not every story about disability has to be like digging into the deepest issue possible. People with disabilities want coverage just like anyone else is getting. You can do a positive story about disability and not have it be an inspiration porn story. You can just, emphasize something really interesting or cool or positive someone is doing. Like I've highlighted local disabled-led businesses and organizations that are doing really great work in the community or creating really cool products, and just do that coverage the same way you would cover any other story. And it can be great, and it can give you a break too from hearing, not every story about disability has to be super serious.
Next, we have a question from Sylvia. She says, oftentimes disability issues are seen as physical disabilities, but there are also mental, emotional, and behavioral disabilities. Do you cover and report about them differently? Emily L., why don't we start with you on that?
I think that the answer is yes, but perhaps not in the way that maybe the question intends. For me, I cover every disability related topic differently in the sense that I don't think you can approach any one specific disability as a blanket thing. Disability community is very much an umbrella term, but under that umbrella, there are, as I was talking about before, more than 1 billion people. And so you have more than 1 billion experiences, opinions, ideas of disability. And when I think about how I want to convey the disability experience, I can't simply do it through, for example, my own lens as someone with a physical disability. I have to be very mindful of the fact that my experience with my disability is not the same as anybody else's experiences with their disability. And so if I'm interviewing somebody who has a non-apparent disability, I want to recognize that I'm coming to them with my own lens, but that their experience is going to be their own experience. If I'm covering a story where someone has a mental health disability or someone has a cognitive disability, I'm thinking about what can I do to make this appropriate for them in terms of being accessible for communication purposes. How can I make this an interview where I'm being emotionally sensitive and not potentially triggering a difficult response? So it's not so much that I'm treating each person differently because they have different types of disabilities. It's that I'm treating each person as an individual person and recognizing that I need to not use that blanket approach because it doesn't work. It's the same thing with reporting, I think, on pretty much any story with any person, disability or not. You approach that person as a whole human being, as an individual, and you try not to reduce them to any one part of themselves. Even if your story is about disability, that doesn't mean that the only thing about the person that you're interviewing is that they're disabled. They hold a multitude of other identities, and we have to recognize how those identities overlap with their experiences and how it impacts their experiences. So I'm always trying to be mindful of how I am communicating with anyone in anything that I cover, and how the writers that I work with are coming to the stories themselves, and what I can do to not impose my own thinking and my own lens on them, but rather say, okay, this is your experience. This is how you're coming to the table. This is how you're showing up. I want that authentic view to be part of the story. Yeah, so I think that's where the differences come in for me.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is open to the group. Ariel says, how and when should we consider the curb cut effect while writing about disability? Does anybody want to take that one?
I can if you want.
Sure.
Also just say, like, again, everything Emily and Alfonso say is just like so good. And I think also as far as that question, like, I think part of that is also if you're seeing a lot of events about physical disability and you're seeing less about people with intellectual, emotional, or mental health disabilities. And also, just a great statistic, 50% of Americans have a pre-existing condition. We look at that 1 in 4 statistic a lot, but really there a lot of pre-existing conditions, a lot of mental health conditions are disabilities too. It just might be those people are harder to find in your community. They might not have the same platform. I think that that's something, I don't know if you agree, Emily, but I think a lot of our community's discussions in recent years have been about who's getting the biggest platform, because a lot of those people who are getting that biggest platform are well-spoken, physically disabled white people and men. And it's not the people who have multiple marginalized identities. And especially for people who have an intellectual disability, a cognitive disability, a mental health disability, they might be in a different kind of housing. They might not have access to their own transportation. So you really need to find the groups that they're connected with. And from what I understand with this question, I'm understanding the curb cut effect to be the fact that if you aren't disabled, you can still access a curb cut effect. You can still push a stroller down it or bring your suitcase. You know, it still helps you. And, you know, to be honest, I find it kind of tired that we have to make stories like, you should care about this because it'll help you too. Like, who doesn't like an elevator so you don't have to walk up the stairs? Like, who doesn't, you know, like, you benefit from this too, you should want it too, because that's not going to make, I just don't think that always makes people care about it. Like when I was in college, with my disability, sometimes walking up a lot of stairs can be harder for me. And I had a 4th floor class. When the elevator would routinely break down that building, everyone else could go to class. And even though I can walk and I don't maybe look disabled to other people, I couldn't get to class on the days that broke down. But I would tell people, I'd be like, oh, like, this is super frustrating that this elevator keeps breaking down. And other people are like, yeah, it's annoying. I just take the stairs. And I'm like, well, I can't take the stairs. I think that we have to think about how we're telling stories to non-disabled people. And we need to think about ways to help them understand why it's important. And sometimes that is saying, hey, this could be you someday. Hey, you should care about what's happening in long-term care because your parents might need long-term care. You might need long-term care. But we also have to just help people understand like the humanity of these problems. And like Alfonso pointed out, like, ride the subway with someone who has a disability, explain their experience, because when we put things, you know, into, you know, especially talking about long-term care, if we're just like, oh, Medicaid dollars and the cost of reimbursement per person, then you just see someone as a number, and you just see a curb cut as something that like maybe can help everyone, but at the end of the day, if it's not there, it doesn't matter to me. We need to help people understand like that emotional, that experience of being disabled. So I hope that covered it.
I think it did. Gina has this question: home care is in serious jeopardy. How can media attention be drawn? Alfonso.
I mean, I think like any other story, it begins with pitching a story that you hope makes a difference. And it's tough. I think a lot of these questions overlap because I think it sort of relates back to the curb cut question too, which is the challenge of the reality that some of these stories appear so niche that how does it appeal? How does it relate to the broader audience? And taking a step back even further, how do you pitch that story, right? Because you and I think Emily touched it before when talking about her own editor. You have to make the case of why is this not only relevant to people with disabilities, but the broader community, and that's where I think at least in the pitch and trying to get your story out there, you can try to make the case for, well, everybody should care about this because whatever. And if it's a housing issue, again, make the case about how this could affect you or someone you know, or one day this might be you. But before all these things, and one of the challenges in particular now, and it's sort of a blessing and a curse, is that everything is driven by metrics, right? So you do one of these stories, whether it's about housing issues or anything else, and that day or the next day you get a report how many people viewed it, how many subscribers did that translate to, what have you. And the reality is, with some of these stories that are perceived as niche, the interest may be fairly modest. And it becomes a kind of like chicken and the egg thing, that because you anticipate that there's not going to be a lot of interest, either you don't do it, or you sort of like, you kind of do the quickie job with a story, and you do something that is short and not necessarily a very compelling. And again, because of that, it doesn't get a lot of readers. So I think with all these things, a lot of it is on the reporter who wants to do the story to I think in the presentation, how do I make this as compelling, as sexy, for lack of a better word, as possible. And a lot of that, I think certainly now, less so if you're working in radio, or even strictly in print. One of the benefits of Newsday and the direction that Newsday's gone in the last few years is that there's more of a video component with Newsday TV, and it is this whole new platform to deliver really compelling visuals. So, take advantage of that, and if you're talking about housing issues, it's one thing to have a really dry headline that says something about housing, but if you can get into one of these situations and actually deliver those visuals, to get a camera in there, get video in there, I think you have a lot better opportunity to reach more people, and then ultimately, hopefully, enact some change.
Thank you. Emily, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to follow up?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. And Alfonso, what you said, like those visuals are so important, especially with the home care crisis. You see, there's a lot of people with disabilities who either live in group homes or they live independently in the community, but they need a direct care worker, a home nurse, someone to support them. And from covering this, the visuals, the things people will tell you about, that will grab people's attention. That will help people to care and understand. Because again, when we talk about Medicaid dollars and reimbursement and money, that's all great. People care about that, but they don't understand what it's like if someone doesn't have an aide for part of the day, so they're stuck in bed or they can't use the bathroom. I've met people who literally don't have someone there to help them go to the bathroom, to get out of bed, to go to work. That impacts their ability to have a job, to go to school, to access their community like they're supposed to do, because that's where our country has been heading the past 50, 60, 70 years. We've been moving towards independent living, but we can't fully get there because these systems that were meant to support people with disabilities are experiencing these issues, like with home care. And the thing is, like Alfonso said, don't always think of it as a quickie story, as the most obvious angle. With home care, there's a huge worker perspective with that. And you should always center people with disabilities and especially focus on their experiences. But a lot of people who are working in home care are immigrants and women. They're often underpaid, or underpaid relative. I as a reporter, I don't want to say something, that's not objective, but like in comparison to fast food workers in New York, home care workers are making less. So to them, they're being underpaid because relative to other jobs they could do that are a lot easier, they're making a lot less, and it's not enough to live on. A lot of them have 2 to 3 jobs. So you can explore those angles. You can tell both sides of the story. You can say, hey, here's a person with a disability and the impact of them, not having enough staff. And you can also say, hey, here's a worker who is becoming disabled themselves because they're working so much to support their family, because this job is not paying them enough to live sufficiently. And not to mention, there's also the impact on, non-paid caregivers, family members, friends, partners, them having to lift a loved one, support a loved one, physically do things for a loved one, that can also be something that impacts their lives. And like, as someone with a disability, I receive care in a lot of different ways, and I'm not like, I don't think we all receive care in different ways, and I'm not saying anything about that impacting someone on an emotional level, but it does impact you on a physical level. If you're physically supporting someone, helping them up, and when you haven't gotten the training and the resources to do that properly, and you're having to do it because there's no one, that properly trained person who's meant to do this for their job can't come in, that impacts you, that impacts your health. And so there's like a lot of angles to these stories, and you don't want to miss them. It just takes a little bit of time and talking to people to get to them.
Thank you. I have one more question from George before I start to wrap this up, because we are crazily running out of time already. Are there any educational training programs that you know of for newsrooms that can help journalists learn how to cover disability issues?
I'll jump in here. I don't know of anything specifically, but in terms of like strategies, tactics you could take, some years back, I was a part of creating a diversity committee at Newsday that sought to look at all kinds of issues of diversity, and I pushed hard for considering communities with disabilities in those discussions. That led to more than once now having essentially off the record roundtable meetings with representatives from the disabilities community, from independent living centers, a lot of different groups, and not necessarily unlike this, but really putting it on those folks to tell us what are we missing, right? What are stories that we should be covering that we're not covering? Helping us cultivate sources, who should we be talking to, where do we find these stories? And again, off the record, it was really more than anything, it was an educational tool for and this is with the highest levels of editors at Newsday at the table. And again, we've done that kind of thing with all kinds of groups, not just on topics of disabilities, but we've had them with representatives of African American communities. We've had them with representatives of Muslim communities, and with just the purpose of sort of a sounding board. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What are we missing? And that is as simple as doing something like this, setting up a Zoom and inviting some folks. So that's one strategy that I think is really beneficial.
Sure. Emyle Watkins.
Yeah, I'll just add, there are some organizations that are starting to do this work. The National Center on Disability and Journalism has a really great style guide that I would advocate you use over AP style, because AP style is still coming up to date. I mean, they just changed their guidance on saying wheelchair bound, like I think a year or two ago, and that was pretty behind the times. And yeah, you can just say wheelchair user. But there's also a lot of organizations popping up. I'm part of a group of disabled journalists that are starting an organization called the Society of Disabled Journalists, and we're going to be putting out educational resources for newsrooms that'll be free. And if you have questions or things that you think we should be covering with that, you can feel free to send them to me or email me, and we can, I can add you to our list for updates. We're hoping to launch by the summer. And also say, like, Erin just emailed me and was like, hey, can you join this? And I think a lot of disabled journalists and disabled communicators are already doing a lot of these trainings. It's just reaching out and seeing what they have available, and I know that Emily does really great advocacy work and does work as a consultant. You can hire accessibility consultants. You can hire disabled people who do disability consulting for organizations to not only make an impact on your coverage, but also your kind of like internal work culture. And like for me, I do a lot of trainings about language and disability history and newsroom. I train news organizations on how they can better cover disability and just kind of the basics of that. And so just reach out. If there's a disabled journalist that you see doing cool work that you like, reach out and say, hey, would you talk to us? Or do you offer trainings? Or do you do consulting? And try and get your organization to budget for these web accessibility consultants and cultural consultants, because they're really important.
All right, guys, it's shockingly already been an hour. I want to thank all three of you so much for your time and expertise. I will ask you guys really quickly, is there anything else that you think that we should know that we have not really discussed at this point? Emyle Watkins, since I have you up, I will go with you first.
Just talk to people with disabilities. Don't be a stranger to us. Even if you get it wrong, I mean, people walk up to me and say weird stuff all the time. It happens. We move through it. If you build a relationship with us, we'll let you know when you're saying something that's like, hey, that's a little too far. That's not right. And you know, just take the time to get to know our community. Watch Crip Camp, which is a great documentary about our history. Read books like Emily's, like Joe Shapiro's. You know, listen to our content, read our content, and just take that time to get to know us a little bit better. And promise you're going to learn a lot from it. And it's none of it's what it's been made out to be in the past. It's a beautiful community, and we'd love to have you and get to know you too.
Thank you, Emily. Alfonso.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what I've heard here, you know, I'm going to take to heart myself. I think I could be doing better on some of this stuff, but I do think that one of the points that came up earlier is that beyond pursuing the story about some issue relating to folks with disabilities, it's also just so okay to include someone in a story about anything else, right? So, you know, the question came up about people with non-physical disabilities that might not be as visible. You know, I've been in situations where you're doing the man on the street thing about whatever a fare hike or a service change, and you know you spot this many people. It's easy to just bypass. If you go and you interview someone and it's apparent that they've got some kind of developmental disability, to say, all right, I'm not talking to this guy, but maybe talk to them, right? Maybe that's a voice. There's no, their voice is less valid than anybody else's, or in that case, even someone with a physical disability. Again, it doesn't just have to be the effort to do a story that strictly relates to disabilities. You can include folks with disabilities in a story about whatever, and I'm sure they want to be heard.
Thank you. Emily L.
I think everything that could be said has already been said, but I think that I would just reiterate my guidance from earlier: nothing about us without us. Remember to center the disability community. Ask yourself who's missing from the conversation and what you can do to bring people with disabilities into the conversation. And also, I will just drop in the chat a way that people can find me. Oh, I thought I could drop it in the chat, but I guess I can't. I'll just drop it to the host and the panelists, and then if there's a way to disseminate it afterwards, that would be cool. But I appreciate everybody who took the time to join.
Again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to our participants. Thank you for all your questions. We appreciate your time on this very important topic. And join us again later this month for our next exciting topic.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.